Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these things. And today we're talking about international trade, and especially international trade as it relates to basic income. So Mitchell on the live stream has started us off with a couple of questions, which I think we'll be exploring for a lot of the discussion. He says, how do different currencies play into differences in trade? How would basic income be affected if it is only in a few countries versus if it's in all the countries?
Good question.
Yeah. So I want to go around, get people's initial thoughts on how you imagine basic income and international trade interacting with each other, especially if basic income is at the level of an individual country or some of the individual countries.
We're answering that question now.
Or just initial thoughts on basic income and international trade. If you want to answer that question.
I guess they relate to each other strongly because, like, if you increase consumer spending in many countries, that could dramatically increase international trade, I imagine. Especially countries that don't have a lot of consumer spending now, that could change the landscape of international trade quite a bit. So, for example, if you gave a lot of people in a currently relatively poor country, like a relatively high basic income, they would potentially consume a lot of things from.
So if you're giving the people in the poor country a basic income in dollars, like paid for by America, is that what you mean? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess it depends. So all those questions are kind of interrelated that he asked, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even if it's not in dollars, like if it's not totally trivial when converted to dollars, then on average it would increase like their international participation, the international participation of the country.
Okay, I have some thoughts on that, but
I would think maybe, but
I think it depends. Yeah.
What exactly is the question? There's sort of like
basic income and international trade. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Basic income. I feel very positively about both basic income and international trade. I guess one thing I would bring up is that hopefully, with a basic income, basic income might take a little bit of the pressure off of movements that are against international trade, because international trade can have the feature of, as the article talks about, benefiting both countries as a whole, but obviously harming specific groups. And one of the major ways that it does that is through jobs and labor.
Okay.
So a basic income wouldn't completely eliminate these conflicts of sort of small group interests versus large group interests, but it would take some of the pressure off because people would have another means of income. And so I would hope that it would make it easier to have more sort of globally beneficial trade.
So you're saying that if people aren't as worried about losing their jobs to imports, then they might be more amenable to trade. And if they had a basic income, they would be potentially less worried about that.
Potentially, I would hope that they might.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one relationship I see.
Yeah. David?
I mean, one of the more interesting aspects of that would be country under embargo. So, like, let's say that Palestine had a basic income. They can't import a lot of things, so they cannot trade in many things.
Right.
And that's honestly where my mind goes. It's like, how do different countries play into different trades? It's like, well, if you look at, if every country had a basic income but nothing else geopolitically changed, then you'd have North Korea kind of cut off, only able to buy things from China, and then only certain things. You'd have Palestine only able to import food and like absolute necessities and not construction materials. So everyone could eat all they want, but they couldn't live anywhere, And I just find that if certain countries were the only countries to institute basic income, it wouldn't really have any impact at all on international trade. Whereas if other countries like the United States had it, I mean, we would consume more. Some of that consumption would be from domestic production, some of that would be from international production. But I honestly wouldn't expect a huge change in the percentage of GDP that is spent in international trade. Like the trade surplus or deficit wouldn't be impacted too much in a modern industrialized country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
have a lot of thoughts about international trade. I mean, I was struck by like one of the things that Bethany talks about, that we do a lot of like tariffs, and everybody like, oh, but like, you know, we want to like protect American workers from getting undercut by foreign cheap products. And so if the US had a basic income that was enough for people to live on, that would make that a lot smoother, because it's like, okay, like we'll import these cheap things and that's fine, because people don't need to like make steel in order to have a job. They can just like have a basic income and use a basic income to buy cheap steel from somewhere else.
Well, the other part of that is they might accept less wages, and hence it would increase domestic production.
Yeah.
Like if you're a steel worker and you're used to making whatever, and you're willing to take $1,000 less a month, maybe that all of a sudden makes U.S. steel more competitive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely possible.
I mean, I don't know what the cost ratio is on steel, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are good thoughts. Richard?
Well, if people aren't worried about their wages, they would be able to automate things, and that would make the U.S. economy more competitive against foreign economies. If the U.S. is the only one with a basic income, and so they would be able to ship out more steel or toys or whatever. And so if only the U.S. has the basic income, then they would be able to actually buy more things, and that would improve the conditions in, say, Africa or whatever, because they would be able to build more factories and things.
And sell things to Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think everyone has some good initial thoughts, and I think a lot of this stuff depends on a lot of different variables. So in which we have 3 different countries. This country is Shoe Land. This country is Chair Land. I think that's a chair. That's how they look. Something like that. Maybe not a triangle.
Why did it get?
You know.
Oh, that's a cushion.
There, it's got like, yeah, there we go.
Ah, it's a fancy chair.
It's a fancy chair. It's got all the things. It's got the legs and the seat at the back. And then we got
no arms.
We got Hatland.
Hatland.
So that's a hat, not a condom, or a penis. Here, let me actually make that a little better. I don't know. That's more of a hat there.
Is it?
There we go. I don't know. It's Hatland.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna start by imagining that for whatever reason, maybe trade sanctions or whatever, all these countries are cut off from each other in trade. But we're gonna have some differences between the 2 countries. We're gonna imagine that in this world, people like to have shoes and hats and chairs, and generally they kind of go together. So you wouldn't want a shoe unless you had a hat and a chair to go with it. So we're going to say that Shoe Land is, each of these countries can produce all 3 of these things. Shoe Land is really good at producing shoes. So it takes 1 resource for them to produce a shoe, and it takes 2 resources for them to produce a chair, and it takes 3 resources for them to produce a hat. And the same thing all the way around. Chairland takes 1 resource to produce a chair. Hatland takes 1 resource to produce a hat. Now, the other thing that's different between these three countries is that Shoe Land is the richest one. So they can actually produce 360 combined sets of shoes, chairs, and hats. Chairland can produce 240 sets of shoes, chairs, and hats. And then Hatland can only produce 120 sets of these things. So each of these countries, if we imagine that they are producing at full capacity for their consumers, then their consumers must have some source of income in order to be able to spend and buy that stuff. So within each country, consumers are spending using a combination of wages from their jobs, borrowing, and basic income. If we've talked here before that I don't think a country can really reach its efficient full productive capacity unless it has a basic income in place. So we're assuming that all three of these countries have a basic income, but the basic income, if they all have the same population, the basic income here is like 3 times the basic income here, and the basic income in the chairland is 2 times the basic income in Hatland. You guys with me so far?
I missed something about why that was the case.
Shoeland is 3 times as rich as Hatland.
Oh, I missed that.
Or
Okay.
has 3 times the productive capacity to produce
Gotcha.
sets of all 3 of these things.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. Okay. So there we are. That's kind of where we're starting. Now we can imagine that suddenly trade opens up. They've discovered each other or whatever, and now they can trade with each other freely. What do they want to do? And the article talks about this, about comparative advantage. So Shoeland has a comparative advantage in shoes, Chairland has a comparative advantage in chairs, and Hatland has a comparative advantage in hats. So Hatland, they're already producing, or let me actually look at these notes that I've written down. So it's easier to do Hatland first, because they're the ones whose capacity is limited. So it turns out that they can double the total output for their citizens. Instead of producing 120 hats using 120 resources and 120 shoes using 240 resources and 120 chairs using 360 resources, they can produce 240 hats using 240 resources. Then they can trade 240 hats for 240 shoes, and then they can trade 240 hats for 240 chairs. Right? So they've kind of doubled everything they can do. As it turns out, Chairland can't double everything they do, because the number of hats they can get is restricted by Hatland's ability to trade with them. Hatland is limited by their productive capacity for hats. So I'm not going to go through that whole thing again, but as it turns out, the Chairland is going to now be able to produce 420 sets of goods instead of 240, so they get a 1.75x improvement in what they're able to do. And then Shoeland gets a 1.417x improvement in how many sets of goods they're able to provide for their consumers, including trade. So everybody wins. The poorest country wins the most because they get all the benefit from everybody, and then this guy's trade is limited by the fact that these guys have lower productive capacities. But everybody still wins, and these guys are only producing hats. That's all they do. All they do is produce hats for themselves and then trade them for shoes and chairs. These guys produce only chairs and hats because they have to make up the hats that they can't get from these guys. These guys still produce all 3, but they get as many hats and chairs as they can from the other guys. Right? So there we are. So the basic incomes, if you're just assuming that there's some kind of neutral currency that all of these countries share for whatever reason, the basic incomes are going to increase proportionately to the proportionate increase in the availability of goods for consumers. So far that's pretty straightforward. Anyone have any questions so far? And I'll leave this framework up here as we kind of discuss things later
I don't know
on.
if you want to write anything down. There were like several key concepts in there, and you didn't make any notes. So if you're going to refer back to
you
it.
want like a
So
3, 2,
2x 1.75x 1.4. Actually, I should write them all below so it's consistent. 1.41x. Yeah. And that's the benefit that they get from trade. And the basic incomes that their economies can sustain improve commensurately to the increase in the production that's available to their citizens. Right. If you're assuming that the consumer spending is being funded fully.
Okay.
Right. If countries don't have a basic income, then that's going to limit their total productive output for their own citizens. Right? So if Hatland doesn't have a basic income, it's not going to be able to produce as much stuff for its own, as many hats for its own people, or trade for as many chairs for its own people. But these guys can take advantage, and they can increase their basic incomes to buy the extra hats. So you can still have the full productive capacity going in Hatland, but everybody else benefits from that because they're not, instead of producing their hats from for their own citizens, they're exporting their hats. So in the initial scenario, it was kind of trade neutral. Everyone had an even balance of trade. No one's running a surplus or a deficit in terms what they're trading with each other.
Right.
Same amount of stuff going both ways. Now, if a country is failing to provide stuff for their own citizens, and they still want to produce stuff, other people have money to spend that they can buy and activate that. So other countries can take advantage if a country is not paying a basic income to its citizens.
And as a sort of like subtle side note, I don't want to muddy things too much, but this country would still be net better with the trade than without, right? If it's paying money to people, like say through the labor market.
Still better, right? They're still better off with trade than without, because there is some income going to be coming to their consumers through the labor market.
Right. So you say take advantage, but the trade isn't making them worse off. It's just
the trade is not making them worse off, but the trade is making the countries with basic income better off than the countries that don't. Than it is making the countries that don't have basic income, and the fact that this country doesn't have a basic income is making these guys even more better off than they would be if he also had a basic income.
I see. Interesting.
Does that make sense?
If you're an individual country, you might want like free trade and you guys to be the only ones with a basic income.
If you only care about your own citizens.
If you only care about your own citizens, and then you can just make it like larger and larger to take advantage of everybody's productive capacity.
Right. So if we're shoe land and we have a basic income, and hat land is China and they don't have a basic income, we keep printing money and handing it to our citizens or whoever I guess it gets a little bit complicated because now we can get into like whose currency is whose and how does that interact. But generally speaking, if we have a basic income and China wants to take our money, we can activate China's productive capacity for our own benefit, take all the steel, and then that's less to go to the Chinese consumers, partly because the consumers just don't have the money to buy it. China lately has had a lot more domestic consumption. So that's why they're not like importing recycling from us anymore, because they're generating so much of their own and that kind of thing. But they're not doing a full-on basic income. So that's that. Then there's the question of different currencies, and all of this. I think it's important to have this framework in mind, and then it's going to quickly get way more complicated than even I can explain.
So there's already 3 points I want to highlight because you're just going like so fast.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I'll slow down.
Some pretty important concepts.
Yeah.
So one concept is that like comparative advantage leads everyone to be better off with free trade, even if certain countries are richer than other countries.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember my second point. The second point is that all else being equal, the countries with the lower productive capacity actually benefit more in this example than the others from the trade.
Yes, the comparative advantage makes everyone better off, and it makes the poorer countries disproportionately better off.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then the third point is the one you just made about how if consumers in your own country don't have spending power commensurate with your productive capacity and there's free trade, then other people are benefiting even more from the trade than you are, although everybody's benefiting.
Yes.
So those are already like three pretty
Yeah.
complicated, interesting points. I just wanted to mark those in my head before we moved on to more interesting, complicated points.
Yeah, and I'm gonna quickly bring up currencies because this was Mitchell's question. So now let's say that each country has its own currency,
right.
And they might start off equal to each other or something like that. But each country's currency its value depends on its ability to be exchanged for something right? So if shoe land has a certain amount of currency flowing into its country, into its factories and all of that, both from domestic consumption and from trade abroad, that has to match up. If they don't want inflation, that has to match up with how much they're actually producing in their country. And it's the same thing for the other countries. So the currencies are almost backed up by the productive capacities of the individual countries.
Wait, could you say that one more time?
So shoe land is capable of producing a certain amount of stuff. It's producing a certain amount of shoes, hats, and chairs.
Yeah.
Right. Now, in order for prices to remain stable, the flow of consumer spending, not the amount of money in existence, but the flow of consumer spending has to match up with that productive capacity, so that the same amount of money is chasing the same amount of goods.
But how is this different now that we have separate currencies than when we all have the same currency?
The difference is that so at first it's not different, but if you've got a bigger country that's maybe got stronger monetary policy or something like that, like the United States does, then maybe people disproportionately trust that country. So even if everybody's paying their own citizens a basic income, the dollar or the shoe land currency might be the strongest currency, and that means people in Hatland and people in Chairland really like the shoe land currency, and maybe they want to hold assets that are denominated in that currency and that kind of thing. So the fact that there is extra demand for the currency beyond just what's going towards the production means that shoe land can afford to create even more money, so they can spend the money and buy hats from Hatland. But Hatland, instead of just taking that currency and turning right back around and buying shoes from Shoeland, they might want to save some of that currency because it's a really stable, good currency.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I have another question now.
Yeah, I just want to go. I just want to say one more thing, which is that means that this is another way in which you can have kind of a sustained trade imbalance in the global economy. So if Shoeland's currency is the world reserve currency and everyone kind of wants to hold it, that means that they want to kind of have a stream of currency flowing away from Shoeland towards them, and that means there's a stream of goods flowing in the other direction. So that means Shoeland is perpetually importing more than it's exporting, and that's kind of sustainable as long as the currency is strong.
So here's my other question. With your basic income example, where Hatland didn't have as much spending money through basic income.
Yeah, back when they didn't have the basic income, you mean?
Sure, yeah. It seems like, wouldn't they recoup some of that by the fact that all of their produced stuff is getting purchased by the other guys? Like, I'm trying to think about how that affects the balance of their own consumers' money.
Right. So the question is, what's the mechanism by which money gets into the hands of consumers? So if it's just the factories, et cetera, that are profiting and getting that money coming in, then maybe some of that goes to laborers, but not all of it. So you're still not activating the full.
So they recoup like some of that, but not all of it through that, basically. I guess it's like
depends
sustainable.
what you mean by recoup. Like you said before, the workers are still getting paid more because they're producing more. They're producing at the full capacity, but they're still not making up what they would have had if they'd had a basic income.
I guess that's what I'm asking. Like,
Yeah.
It doesn't end up being made up.
No, because in the end, what's happening is that you're actually more of the hats are going to Shoeland and Chairland. If you look at the actual product of hats, fewer of them are available to local consumers.
But if 100% of that went to consumers, then it would be an imbalance that corrected itself, right?
If 100% of what went to
The
consumers?
sales money. I'm trying to just think about
If
the logic
100
of it.
Um,
I haven't done the math, so I don't know if that adds up, but it seems like. Because if every hat is worth a certain amount.
If 100% of the sale money went to consumers,
Which of course would never happen. Like, that's impossible, but I'm just saying, like, I'm trying to understand the logic of it.
yeah. So you're imagining an economy here where even if it were on its own, 100% of the income from production would be going back to consumers, and it would just keep cycling.
Yeah,
like
I
that.
guess so.
Yeah. So I guess that would. Yeah, because then the necessary basic income to activate the full potential benefit for consumers is zero in that case. So yes, you're right. If they're importing from, if everyone who bought a hat from Hatland and from Chairland and from Shoeland, if everyone who's buying hats from Hatland if all those hats, if all that money is going straight to the laborers and all of that, then you don't need any basic income. Yeah, that's a good point, Richard.
What if there a fourth country that provides resources to all the three producing countries, like there is in the real world?
There is?
Well, pretty much. Like say in Africa, where they produce like all the, let's say, the wood and the.
Africa is very heavily mined and has oil exports, but they don't actually produce much else in many of the countries.
How is that different from like shoe? Why couldn't you just call them like woodland or oil land or something?
Well, so like I think Richard's point is like you need shoes to be like parts of a hat, or you need wood to be parts like the rim of a hat and like the legs of a chair and the sole of a shoe. But like the wood in and of itself is not a resource that has any implicit value. So it increases the productive capacity of any of the three countries that can obtain wood, but it doesn't necessarily have any value in and of itself.
Right. So you're talking about materials that are used in the production of these various products and having them being imported from other countries.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's you can certainly add
I think
complexity
it's
to
the
this.
same general logic, right?
It's the same general
for the points
logic.
you're trying
Like
to make.
you'd be trading hats for wood. Maybe we could imagine a scenario in which nobody in Hatland wants a hat because you can't use a hat for anything, but it can be used in the production of chairs and shoes or something like that. So now, without trade, you just don't have an economy and you're dead.
Yeah.
But with trade, it's the same thing, except instead of everybody in every country kind of like having their own instead of everybody needing a hat, a shoe, and a chair, you need a shoe and a chair, and a shoe and a chair take hats to make. And in order for that to work, you have to have trade. Yeah.
I was thinking more about leather, like a leather cushion for the chair, leather.
Yeah.
Same idea.
Makes
Yeah.
slightly more sense.
Yeah. Oh, right. Then hats for.
The part of which hats are just
Okay.
chairs.
Yeah.
We just like these are all just symbols.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
fine.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've got some inappropriate comments on the live stream.
Can you kick people off of it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Let's do that.
Let's find out.
First time for everything.
Report unwanted comment, harassment or bullying. Oh God, to choose one. This is harassing someone else. Okay, report done. Okay, block. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Did you have more to the spiel that you wanted to do?
I mostly want to have that up there as we start
Okay.
getting more into the conversation. Unless you guys... Oh yeah, there is one other thing I wanted to say, which is that, like I was saying before, if one country has a really strong currency, if Shuland's currency is really strong, then that means they're getting more stuff from the other two countries. So now they can raise their consumer spending even higher, or raise their basic income even higher. And then these guys, that's a trade-off. That's like a zero-sum thing. So now these guys are getting less out of the deal
Wait, say that one more time.
because the currency is strong and everybody wants
Right.
to hold the currency. Now more actual goods are
Flowing
flowing
towards
to
them.
Shuland. Yeah. And then the citizens of Hatland and Chairland are maybe not getting the 2x benefit anymore, the 1.75x benefit
Maybe slightly
anymore.
less. Yeah.
Maybe it's slightly less. Yeah. So if Shuland really wanted to be really nice and they cared more about just their own citizens, they could provide enough basic income to the citizens of these countries to make up the difference and bring it back to these levels.
Right.
Or if they wanted to feel really great, I mean, like we're talking about 1.41x, but they started out being having three times as much.
Yeah. Exactly.
So if these guys really wanted to, they could
If all of these were agents within the same country, then it would be a different situation, right?
all of these were agents within the same
So you're
country.
saying like if country X cared about all of them, but what if they were all like, because you also get trade with,
Yeah.
it's a similar idea within a country, right?
So you're thinking about instead of these being countries, there's one guy who's good at making shoes, and another guy's good at making chairs, and someone
Yeah,
else is
I'm
good at
I'm
making
trying to
hats.
play with the fact that like it seems like a lot of the same logic would apply, but some of the things about like how the basic income is structured or the currency would be different.
Can you say more?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you had like 3 different states within a country, let's say there's states within the United
okay.
States. That's just one way to look at
Because
it.
they all share the same currency.
They all share the same currency, and there is a real superordinate agency or like government that theoretically cares about them all equally. So that's like different. That's kind of like part of the thought.
Well, if
experiment.
you have 3 states within a country, it's very similar to what we started with free
Right.
trade. The difference is that there's also free movement of citizens.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's not
So if you are in, Hat State and you're getting your basic income, first of all, the basic income wouldn't be dependent on each state's productive capacity. It would be dependent on the productive capacity of the country as a whole. So if the United States is paying a basic income to everyone equally, the people in Hatland are getting the same basic income as the people in Shoeland. Maybe
Right, so that's complicated.
maybe prices are cheaper in Hatland because they.
But isn't that just where you were going with the thought experiment? That's why I brought it up. Weren't you just talking about this country giving these other people basic income to even it out? Isn't that similar to them all being within a country where they get the same?
If you have free movement.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
different if you don't.
Well, it's different if you don't, because the prices could be different in different countries. So if you're getting the same basic income, and prices in Hatland happen to be cheaper than prices in, like, this is kind of an extra variable. But if prices are cheaper here, then people will want to move to Hatland with their lower basic income or with the same basic
But
income.
that was like
Yeah.
not really the point I was trying to emphasize. It doesn't really matter. I was just trying to give a real world example where you actually have investment in the three different things, other than just like an altruistic country or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. So if you had like one world government or something like that, then each country is now a state, and you've got like one world currency. And
But then you also have free movement, so it introduces the same concepts that you were just talking about.
Yeah, how do you do it without free movement?
Could
or
you
is
make
there a
them three
real world
individuals?
example of?
Individuals can't move to become other individuals.
But yeah, I mean, I was thinking actually more about China, where movement is very restricted, even within China for Chinese
Okay,
citizens.
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, but they don't have a basic income, but they do have certain benefits. But it's different in different regions. And I'm actually not an expert on China. If it's three different people, yeah, then you're not. Then when you're talking about a person, the productive capacity of the person is the labor they can contribute, right?
Yeah, like they're skilled at hat making versus chair making.
Right. So now you're back to kind of labor and wages, and yeah, it's going to be different. The person whose time is worth more is going to make more, and the person whose time is worth less is going to make less. If you're calibrating the basic income to the productive capacity of the overall economy, then it can make up the difference. But if you're calibrating it to the productive capacity of the individual person, you're just calibrating it to their labor.
What do you
and
mean
that's
by
their
make
wage.
up the difference?
So if you're pooling the productive capacity of the economy and you're trying to activate that full productive capacity, then you want to give the basic income to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's the same basic income that everyone gets, regardless of whether you're good at producing a lot of stuff with your labor or only a small
Right,
amount.
but the shoe guy, if he's better can produce better shoes or more shoes than the other guys can do hats or chairs, will still make more money on top of that.
Yeah.
Well, people only need so many shoes is the other part of it.
I guess so.
Well, that's true. Yeah. I'm not sure where we're going with this.
I don't know. Never mind. I feel like I sidelined things. I was trying to isolate some interesting elements, but it didn't really work out. So
Okay.
Chairs are more limited.
never
You
mind.
only have so many chairs.
I mean, but we're in this weird like symbology where like hat, chair, shoe is like the unit of
Yeah.
something.
Everyone needs like one of those sets a year or some multiple.
I think we
those.
hadn't really introduced the idea of like saturation of demand, like people don't want.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that
That's
gets complicated. Is like,
different, yeah.
let's say you're in shoe land and your production capacity is 360, and it's 1, 2, and 3. But you only need 60 of each unit every year in shoe land.
Yeah.
Then you can produce everything for your own people that they possibly want. Trade would mean that you have extra capacity, and all of a sudden somebody goes out and invents pants. And then maybe you're pant land from then on because you've now invented pants. Like, I mean, it gets really kind of convoluted when you introduce extra, like, actual real-life concepts like, slack capacity that I know that you always talk about with, basic income would increase with like utilize unutilized capacity in the economy. And it's like, well, if you're already using all of your capacity, let's say you're using you need 60 of each, 360, 1, 2, and 3 times units, you're perfect. But trade makes you have extra capacity, which is what some people think is going on in the United States right now. Argumentatively, whatever, but...
Do people really think, though, that, like... Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. That everyone in the U.S. has, like, as much stuff as they could possibly ever want?
Well,
seems
so what
not true.
people think is, like, steel, for example, going back to that. The U.S. has laid off steel workers. It has the raw materials for steel, but we import steel.
Oh, I see. So
we
with
have
respect
dormant
to that
steel
particular
plants,
good.
but there's steel. So, like, if you add a tariff, then you start utilizing more of that steel producing capacity. There's downstream effects of that, like, people who use steel in products end up not making some of those products and blah, 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 because now it's more expensive and then consumers don't buy them and et cetera, et cetera. But
also those people's time is now being spent on making steel that didn't need to be spent on making steel before.
but somebody else was using that time to make steel in another country.
Right, but I guess the idea
So-
of trade that seems special here, that's like worth highlighting, is that if you have different comparative advantages for whatever reason,
But like
Yeah,
steel,
he's got
still
that part.
beneficial.
yeah,
Okay.
steel
So-
specifically, there isn't a huge comparative advantage. The big advantage is labor.
Right, so that's the comparative advantage of China,
Yeah.
right? For
So,
steel.
so the point that you're trying to make is that sometimes we're going to end up in a situation where we have the capacity to make stuff, but we just don't need it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think that's true. And I think that would be wasteful to try to activate that capacity. Sometimes there are resources that we just don't need to use, and that's okay to conserve those
Right.
resources.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's not a problem. And certainly, if we find a way to use those resources for something else, to use that labor for something else, that's great. But sometimes it's hard to define what the best use of people's time is too. So sometimes it's I think anytime you're activating labor, it shouldn't be arbitrary. We shouldn't just be making people work at steel, production.
Yeah, I don't think that's
Yeah.
what he was saying. I
Yeah,
think he was just
I was just kind of like
Yeah.
continuing on.
Getting
that.
No, I
onto
just-
yours.
I
Yeah.
like this example a lot because it kind of
Yeah.
like exemplifies some things. Like, let's say every country needed 60 of each unit. Shoeland could make 180 pairs of shoes and only be using half of its capacity,
Right.
and trading those shoes to Chairland for its reciprocal 60 chairs, and its hat or shoes to Hatland for its reciprocal hats. But then Hatland can't get all the chairs and shoes at once
Right.
necessarily.
So potentially, Shoeland could activate some of its capacity to make shoes for other people, or repurpose some of that capacity to be able to provide other things and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Somebody will invent pants. I like that.
Somebody will invent pants.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody in Shoeland invents pants. Everything gets disrupted in
economy is
international
just-
markets.
No,
Yeah.
I like the idea with three because like the invention process or like the
Right.
growing of the economy through innovation
Yeah.
is like very simple to like somebody instead of somebody inventing a better phone or et cetera,
Right.
you could say they invent socks.
Right.
They realize that shoes are so much better with socks.
so much more comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doc.
Yeah. So anyone have any more thoughts to add to that before we get to some quotes from the article?
I feel like you've covered all of the important points. I was kidding. But you did go through a lot of points, which are good.
Yeah, and this stuff can get really complicated when you get into financial markets, and we didn't even talk about carry trade, where so that's when the central banks set the interest rates in the different countries through monetary policy, and then if there's two currencies and one of them has a higher interest rate, then you might borrow in the lower interest rate currency and then lend in the higher interest rate currency. So buy up debt or assets or something in the higher interest rate currency, and then you make a profit there, and then you sell it back, and you get the kind of that difference. So that's carry trade because you're carrying the currency with that
Interesting.
higher interest rate.
And the countries are doing this for other reasons with respect to their own like stable currency concerns, so they don't want to change them despite this.
Right.
They don't
Well,
want to change the interest rate to be
sometimes they're forced to, because if you have a continued interest rate disparity and there aren't
Right.
other things causing people to desire one asset or another,
Yeah, exactly.
that's going to cause the currency with the higher interest rate to appreciate relative to the currency with the lower interest rate,
Exactly.
and that has to be a continuous thing. The appreciation has to happen as long as that disparity is there,
Yeah.
and it will only stop once the relative interest rates are the same again. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
China subsidizes things like steel and cement. So
Yeah.
how would that work with this example?
Yeah, so that's they're I guess they've got their capacity and they're activating it. I mean, it's almost like they're providing a gift to the global economy, or a gift to their own people if they're making these products cheaper. It's I think it can help. It can help people get more stuff. It can help the exports, and it can also help the local citizens, local consumers be able to buy more stuff. I would say it's less efficient than just giving your people a basic income, and then they can activate that capacity through demand instead of kind of this backwards subsidy way.
And they also build ghost cities and that no one can afford to live in, so they just remain vacant.
So I think there's a lot of inefficiency and waste there. Again, I think a lot of what they're doing is they're trying to kind of create jobs and force incomes to consumers that way. But it's a lot less efficient than just handing people the money without the additional waste, because you're wasting their time in addition to wasting all those materials and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I'm
Yeah.
ready for a quote.
All right, so some of us read an article called International Trade, Commerce Among Nations from the International Monetary Fund Finance and Development blog, Brad McDonald. So here's the first quote. If there is a point on which most economists agree, it is that trade among nations makes the world better off. Yet international trade can be one of the most contentious political issues, both domestically and between governments. So this gets, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So this gets back to the issue of what kinds of problems trade causes and what kinds of problems do people perceive it causing. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, like, I think part of this is so you tend to have political motivation be very high by those few and relatively low by the rest of the people. And as a result, it can be difficult politically, even though on net it's actually about benefiting the entire country more than it's costing the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think another big thing is something you brought up earlier, which is that part of the benefit that people perceive is the jobs that they have and the incomes they get from those jobs from being able to produce this stuff. And if we had a basic income, that part of it would kind of go away.
Well, I wouldn't say it would go away, it would get smaller.
That part of it would get smaller, yes.
People still want their extra income, presumably.
People still want their extra incomes, and businesses, of course,
still want their
want
money.
to be able to sell their stuff. Like, you know, imagine when the trade opened up between these three countries and Hatland was producing all three things. Now what are the shoe producers and the chair producers in Hatland going to do? Like, they had profitable businesses before, and now they don't.
Yep.
But everyone's better off in general. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So those special interests kind of don't go away with the basic income.
Yeah.
Also, with national security, they would keep some
capacity on
shares in that.
And it just seems like that benefit may just like actually flow to all the people that like it's like, oh, so like everyone is better off. It's like, well, okay, but like people who were producing chairs and shoes in Hatland, like if the people who like run the hat companies are like, cool, like we're making lots of hats, like we're hiring more people, but like it's not like they're necessarily hiring all of the people who formerly made chairs and shoes. And so like, cool, now we, the CEOs of the hat companies, can double our own salaries, and the people who used to make chairs and shoes are like, so I now don't have a job, and like we haven't increased like social benefits significantly. Like international trade seems like a terrible thing. It's like really like the terrible thing is capitalism, but like
I mean,
to be like everyone is better off is not necessarily true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets complicated. I think, you know, most people would say that there's winners and losers, and there's more. There's like a general consensus that there's more winners than losers.
It's more like an on-net gain than an every individual person.
Right.
Yeah, and just and like I just like when we think about like what that net is it like, oh cool, like, you know, we have like there's like $1 billion more that like some people have, but if that's going to 3 people instead of 500 million people.
So like in the example of like NAFTA, the trade benefit to each individual person in the United States is something like $400 per year, and a lot of that is in like reduced cost of produce from Mexico or reduced cost of wood products from Canada. So it is dispersed to at least some degree. Okay. Like you're paying less for food because of NAFTA. That is a fact.
And,
so
and the article points out like you have often greater variety and quality to choose from too, and like all these
avocados are more plentiful in the United States and cheaper in the United States, and they wouldn't really exist in the United States if not for NAFTA. The downside of it is, so every single person rather in the United States is like $400 better off. But I think it was 250,000 people effectively lost their jobs.
Right. So this
and
is
the average wage of those jobs was, let's say, $60,000 a year, and the replacement job that person can get is only going to be $35,000 per year. So, you know, they're $400 better off because of NAFTA, but they're making $30,000 or some odd dollars less because of they couldn't find an equivalent job doing the same thing they used to do.
So that's what I meant when I said like the benefits are more diffused across a larger number of people and the costs are concentrated in a smaller number. So even if the benefits outweigh the costs, I like your example, it's like very concrete. Like there's a vocal minority, of course, because like their costs are so noticeable and so huge. And so, like,
and steel workers specifically, well, steel all of a sudden was being more often made in Canada and automobiles were being made in Mexico. So like those two groups were like, well, hey, we lost these jobs. This is awful. Let's rip up NAFTA. Was kind of the thing.
Right. But in terms of just like resource allocation and the amount that can be offered to different consumers, that's like better off with trade, if that makes sense. If you're kind of, like Alex is doing, saying you have like basic income or something else in terms of like incomes.
Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth rightly pointed out that if you're not increasing the benefits, then you might still have this net diffuse benefit for everyone overall, but it's not as great as it could be if you actually, made sure basic income was at the highest sustainable level. But even if basic income is at the highest sustainable level, all that does is it kind of guarantees you that the poorest person in your economy is as rich as possible. But it might change who that poorest person is. So someone who wasn't the poorest person might be the new poorest person. They might be poorer than they were before.
With a basic income?
With free trade.
Oh, with free trade.
Yeah. So someone who is benefiting from the restrictions on trade might become the new poorest person and be poorer than they were before, even in the presence of a basic income. Yeah. So that's something important to keep in mind.
Yeah. I mean, this is just such a classic problem where, like you said, like there's benefits for society overall, but there's like certain people who lose out, and like how do you?
Well, I think one way to do it is to frame the people who are benefiting from these jobs that depend on these trade restrictions as being like profiting off the suffering of the rest of society.
Because it's like it's hard to morally like weigh, or like it's hard, like there's a lot of empathy for some, like it's hard to kind of consider a little bit of cost to everyone versus this person who's
and it's hard. It's hard for me to go around and say nobody should be entitled to a job when
that's like the only way.
That's how people get their money.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like not a very persuasive position.
I know. I was
right
kind
now.
of joking a little bit. But
I mean, I think it's true in the sense that I think economists and some other people would say it this way. Like this is like that's what when I say the word like special interest, like this is a small group that wants to benefit kind of at the expense of everyone. Yeah. But like
the sugar lobby,
I'm sympathetic to it.
The corn syrup lobby.
All of the lobbies.
All the lobbies,
exactly. Yeah, and I think it's like easier to vilify like the company themselves than like the lobby, but the people that are like losing their jobs.
I think not all the lobbies, but
oh yeah, which lobbies do you like?
Well, like the lobbies that are like I don't know, like trying to decrease the number of guns in hands of children.
The anti-landmine in children area lobby or something.
Like people lobby to have the U.S. go clean up landmines.
Yeah,
in
they
Vietnam.
do. No, it's true.
That's a thing.
So I mean, I think that's a fair point, and I think a lot of the things that people lobby for are really good things. But then the question is, there are a lot of good things that the government should be spending their money on, and is the lobbying just kind of like diverting those funds,
or like is a lobbying system the best way to allocate attention and resources versus something else, because it kind of gets dominated by like who has the most resources to lobby. So it's not maybe so representative of like the wisest way to distribute those resources, but anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. Like I think one thing that's endemic like to this kind of problem, even if we have a small cost, are less motivated than a small group with a large benefit. And so this is the problem for like these kinds of issues. I don't know if I have like a perfect solution to that, but from a political perspective, it's difficult.
Well, then you get like really into like some people will have no interest in a cause whatsoever. Like it does not impact them, but be incredibly passionate about it.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. That's another thing.
Like for whatever reason, good or bad, they're incredibly passionate about it, even if it would have no impact on their lives.
But you also see people who, these are people who would pay the cost, but they identify with the people who.
Definitely.
Yeah,
you see people.
They identify with the people who get the benefit from these restrictions.
Like wealthy people who are in favor of higher taxes on the wealthy or something like that. You mean?
I was more thinking about
the reverse of like poor people who think of themselves as possessed millionaires and are like,
that too.
Tax.
Right.
I heard one day I too will be rich, and I want my children to be able to inherit that.
There was some great quote that was like the United States people in the United States are never going to be okay with higher taxes for the wealthy because every person in the United States views themselves as a millionaire temporarily down on their luck. And it was like something like the Hoover administration or something like that.
That's funny. Yeah, so is that what you were thinking?
No, that's not what I mean.
But
Those are
it's a
good
good
examples.
example.
It's not what I was thinking of at all. I was thinking of the examples of activist movements that are like stand up for protecting jobs or workers' rights, even if they are not necessarily
members of those groups.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
so it
the
gets
same basic
complicated
thing.
on both sides. And I
Yeah.
guess to that point, like I was saying, like if people had other means of supporting themselves besides their jobs, this idea of like everyone deserves a job or whatever would change.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
and maybe we'd be more sensitive to the social costs.
Right.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
Economists and people who care about people's welfare, which are also economists, I don't know. That didn't go the way I wanted it to go. This is why I'm not in the slogan writing business.
I mean, I think most people care about people's welfare.
I know, that's what I
Yeah.
thought halfway through that thought. That's
Yeah.
why it all disintegrated.
Yeah.
Well, because actually economists are studying like how to maximize human welfare. Like that's what
Right.
study of economics is about too.
Right.
Yeah, but the way
And-
we define humans is sometimes really.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of like academic economists.
We should stop
Yeah.
giving so much money to dogs and calling them humans.
What?
No, that's just the way we define
Like
humans.
those people who leave their entire estates to their.
Yeah. What do you mean by the way we define
Oh,
humans?
the way that I feel like I feel like a lot of economics papers are like focused on like managers and business owners and CEOs and being like, we want to like, we're gonna like maximize like the profit for companies with the sort of
Right.
implicit assumption that like trickles down
Right.
to people. And it's not like, oh, we want to maximize, like, I mean, there are economists doing work on like welfare maximization.
Yeah.
But it's often like, oh yes, like how can we make businesses more profitable?
Right.
And, how can we, like encourage consumers to spend more? Like how can we,
Right. I see. Yeah.
like, and so it often feels like the actual laborers and like consumers as like their own people are
Right.
often more just like the like objects in those models as
Yeah.
opposed to the subjects that we actually care about. It's like, oh yes, like how can we maximize
Right.
profit for the CEOs and the startup entrepreneurs and like
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
and less about like yeah, so how can we really think about the negative externalities of like workplace accidents
Right.
on people? It's like so like how can we make this more efficient for the
Right.
CEO?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I
Yeah.
guess I meant in a very broad, at the broadest level, economics is about like understanding people getting better off through trade. But I was speaking very broadly.
I think you're
right.
both right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's
right.
that's what it's about. But then sometimes economists make assumptions that
Right.
make it so their recommendations and their models are not actually the things that would benefit ordinary
Right.
people the most.
Right.
I do think that if you have a basic income in place, then that aligns the profit of. I've said this before,
Yeah.
but that would align. So if you have basic income in place and now you're focusing on the profit of businesses, well, businesses are profiting when they're actually doing things that consumers need.
It aligns
and-
it better.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's fair.
So
Yeah. I suspect there's a large market for those kinds of models, though, now that I think about it. As in, like, the business people with the money to spend on whatever those
Right,
models
right,
are.
right.
Yeah, and it's all like,
Yeah.
oh, like we're gonna make this more efficient and suit it with like the gig economy, where it's like, oh, yeah, it's really good for business to like treat to classify the people who do the labor for you as like contractors because
Right.
you don't have to really pay them, you don't have to give them healthcare,
Right.
and like isn't it so efficient and flexible that people can just like choose when they're working,
Right,
and not
right.
be like, oh look, you need to work 17 hours a day to like actually
Right.
like.
Which is why other countries don't classify contract workers the same way the U.S. does.
That's interesting.
is that right?
Yeah, no, most countries, contract workers actually have to have a set contract. And with the debate,
Wild. It's like it's
I know, and there's a debate in the UK over what are called 0-hour contracts, which are where they give somebody a contract, they sign the contract is for a set period of time, it has certain terms, but at the contract, the company's discretion, I'm not sure if it's a contractor or contractee, sorry, I'm not that well versed in legal language, they can just make the hours of the contract for a period of time 0 and hence effectively negate the contract. So one of the things that they push back against is 0-hour contracts, and I know there have been multiple bills about this. I don't know if any of them ever passed, but to make it so that there is a minimum number of hours on a contract.
Interesting.
So like if you hire a contractor and they work for you, you can't just say, because people were hiring retail workers as zero-hour contractors and saying, oh, we don't need you this week. So they weren't getting any of the benefits of being an employee, and they really were misclassified according to like UK law.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think another thing that relates to this is that, you know, from an efficiency standpoint, like all that flexibility is good. And then maybe part of the problem is that we're expecting employers to provide things like healthcare and stuff like that. So if you have like all of the stuff that makes sense to be provided for everyone, if that's provided by the government, and that includes healthcare and it includes basic income, then, you know, then I think we can celebrate the flexibility and efficiency of the gig economy without feeling bad about it.
I think it's always helpful for me to consider both perspectives in the sense that, Alex, you often point out, like, anytime you're legislating, you're restricting something that theoretically would have been voluntary on both sides. Now, part of the problem with that has to do with bargaining power for me. And so, like, one way to look at it for me is to, like, increase bargaining power through something like a basic income, and then allow people to be really flexible in the way that both sides choose. Because maybe I'm, you know, want to be at home with my kids sometimes, and maybe I want to be able to have a contract that's flexible in certain ways. Not that you couldn't get around it in that system, but, you know, like, maybe there's all sorts of unforeseeable ways that I would like to be flexible as the person being hired as well.
So
you know?
you'd be more likely to drive for Uber if you had a basic income and you maybe wanted to have some spare time. You had some spare time sometimes, but you didn't always know where it would be. Yeah. And like you're willing to accept a moderate wage for it.
Right.
And
that's right. And that could work way better for you than having to choose between a kind of more all or nothing kind of job.
I think the two things that kind of go together that make things suck is that it sucks to be in an economy where we force people to depend on a job, and then we don't follow through and put something in place to make the job
not the best situation,
something that people can depend on, or something that provides them with what they need, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the first part is a mistake, and then the second part is just kind of compounding that mistake, or maybe even it's somewhat unreasonable to expect this to happen, and it's hard to regulate employment in such a way that you can force everyone to be taken care of by some employer somewhere or something like that. Right.
I mean, that used to happen though. Like, the reason it's so embedded into our economy and our culture is because you used to go work for a company for 50 years, or 40 years, or some number of years, and then you retire and you get a pension, and they give you a big party and a gold watch, and they send you on your way. And so people still, like, a lot of things in our economy are set up as if that was still the norm, and it simply isn't for most people. I mean, outside of government jobs and some union jobs, it's really unheard of.
It's tricky though, right? Because there was always like some people who were supposed to have a job to live and were homeless or didn't have a job, and there was the Great Depression. So it hasn't like worked beautifully this whole time.
Right, and when you say it used to be that way, it's like used to be that way for white people. It's kind of like,
it used to be that way for the people who make the rules.
For the people who make the rules, for the people, who the rules were designed to benefit.
And not in the late 1800s either, right? So, like, I mean, at what point? Like, there was a window of time at which this was more common.
Well, I mean, even into, like, it kind of came back again right after the Depression and lasted pretty well from right after World War II into the late 70s. So, like, the people who were, like, veterans of World War II of that generation effectively had that again. So, like,
but I guess again, like, when was it? When did it
exist
exist before though? Because my sense of like labor practices earlier than that weren't like that.
Interestingly, it kind of existed after the Revolutionary War. It existed after the Civil War, and then it would go through these like troughs where it was less common. So, like, after wars, you always kind of got this like Reconstruction boom. Right. Sometimes literally called a Reconstruction.
Yeah. Right.
But and that would lead to a lot of industry, a lot of hiring. People would need to rebuild things, and then like the economy would just kind of take off for a while, and then after 30 or 40 years, around 1898, I believe, you would have a sag. It would be down for a little while. Then after World War I, it came back in boom force for 15 or 20 years, not as much as
So that makes me think about this bargaining power question again too, because like another way for people to have more bargaining power is labor is more in demand. Just in general, and so then you see like more favorable conditions emerging
after wars. Interestingly,
it's kind of I mean, it's kind of.
Or if you have like a massive pandemic and everyone die, like in
That would also increase bargaining
okay.
power.
Yeah,
for
that's
a good
remaining.
one.
Well, so
Asteroid
you
impact,
say that,
yeah.
but this is
Yeah,
what
okay.
a lot of people think ended like the feudal system to a large extent, because half of Europe's population died from the Black Plague,
Yeah.
and so
And-
then labor was in much higher demand.
Mhm.
But it would be really great if we could find another way.
No, like the feudal system though, like that would happen. Like you'd have, have you ever
It
watched
wasn't- yeah.
Downton Abbey? Like the people, he's
Yeah.
like, oh no, those people have always like had that thing going on, and we leave them be because they've been doing that for generations.
Yeah,
and like
right.
that's their right, basically.
Right. Well, that was another example with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
But like in the when was the Black? Like in the 1300s was the Black Death, or like 13 and 14.
Yeah, it
That
happened
kind
a
of
few times.
got into the Enlightenment period
Yeah.
and so on after that, because that was one of the arguments. It was partly bargaining
Well, it led
power.
to like
Yeah.
Freeman and
I like
Freemasons.
I like Bethany's comment. It would be nice if we could figure out a way to. I mean, like clearly, if we don't have a war, that means we have more resources. We
Right.
should have the capacity to be even more prosperous than we are just
and
after
when we
a
just
war.
burned a ton of
Right.
resources, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing though is,
Wars could produce an innovation.
yes,
That's
like the amount of innovation that happens in a year of war is equivalent to, like, they've estimated
Right.
20 years. Some people say 100 years of what would have happened if there
Yeah.
hadn't been that war.
But we could do that without wars too.
Theoretically, I mean,
Yeah, we can
just
pay
have to
for
have
it,
the
right?
like basically people get really interested in
But
paying
people
for
need
like
to be
research.
afraid.
Yeah, so there's a psychological concern about
yeah.
motivation, but
Yeah.
I mean, when you say people need to be afraid, I think the governments need to be afraid, and they have to be motivated to pay for all this stuff, to like run deficits and like activate all the resources and everything. They can. I mean, making them afraid is one way to do it. It would be nice if we could convince them that they could do it anyway and run a basic income and not have problems and that kind of
right,
thing.
and like
Yeah.
fund a lot of research or whatever.
Right.
They
Well,
do
like
during
one of the
war.
things that people actually expect to do this in a not plague or war-based
Right.
economy
Yeah.
is, sorry, like just the renewable energy is becoming cheaper to the point where it is actually starting to become cheaper than
Right.
anything else. So people in Saudi Arabia and Australia and parts of the United States are making these giant batteries for these renewable resources, which at one point in the world, 30 years ago, the largest battery in the world was in Western Mass, and it was an old mine shaft that had been dug out over years with, let's say, iron. I actually don't know what they mine there. And there's a nuclear power plant out there, and at night when people use less power, they would run water up the mountain, and then they had this giant thing seal it up, and then when they needed the power, they would just have a turbine, and the water would fall through the turbine and generate extra power.
Interesting.
And so that system has replicated all over the world since then. But in theory, we could turn all of West Virginia into these giant batteries.
Right.
We could line parts of the United States that were flat and sunny with solar panels, and then mountainous parts of the country into these giant batteries, and that would be an economical boom. Lots of people would have jobs. Everybody would be better off. We'd all have cleaner air. We'd all be, there'd be construction jobs, there'd be maintenance jobs, there'd be monitoring,
Right.
etc. No plague or war, and it would be innovation.
Yeah, it's really cool. I love the water battery.
Yeah.
Never
Yeah.
thought about that before.
That is
No,
Yeah,
yeah, they've
it
done.
totally work.
It was one of,
Yeah.
it's like they literally couldn't turn off the nuclear
Right.
power plant.
Yeah.
They had the power coming out. What do we do with it? Well, they just took an old mine shaft and turned it into what at the time was the world's largest battery, and I believe it could hold enough capacity to power something like 70 or 80,000 homes for 24 hours
Wow.
at the time. I mean,
Cool.
so
I guess it takes a little more to power a home now.
actually a little
I
bit
mean,
less.
Yeah, because of like LED lights and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little
Okay.
bit more energy efficient than we used to be.
Yeah.
Ah,
Okay.
good.
All right.
Cool.
You guys
Next
ready for
quote?
another quote? Yeah.
Born ready.
Back to international trade. The foreign producer also benefits by making more sales than it could selling in its own market, selling solely in its own market, and by earning foreign exchange currency that can be used by itself or others in the country to purchase foreign-made products. So I feel like I don't know if this is saying anything new other than what we've already talked about. We can talk about I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts about this? About maybe about different currencies and how they interact? with international trade.
No, you did such a great job talking about.
I did do a pretty good job.
About how, like, if there's more
Pick up your
of a
feet.
demand for one than
Yeah.
another currency, but otherwise, I guess I wasn't really sure why you need these foreign currencies to do things. Like, why can't you just exchange your own when the time comes?
Exchange your own when the time comes.
Well, it says you can earn foreign exchange currency that can be used by itself or others in the country to purchase foreign-made products. But why can't you purchase foreign-made products with your own currency?
Well, you can.
Right, but you'd have to somewhere along the way it would have to be converted into the
Right.
foreign, or the other country's business would want to accept that currency.
Right.
A lot of times international trade is done in dollars, so people
Right.
kind of convert into dollars in order to buy stuff.
Dollars, or like if people sell into the European Union, euros are generally pretty well accepted
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
the equivalent these days. But like if you have some small currency that, you know, the person who you want to buy something from might go like, oh, that's great, like your South African rand are wonderful, but I really don't want anything from South Africa.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're going to have to go into the currency market and buy some dollars,
Right. I see.
or have that facilitated in some way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you get the coinage.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Okay, let's move on to another one. We talked about this too. Still, even if societies as a whole gain when countries trade, not every individual or company is better off. When a firm buys a foreign product because it is cheaper, it benefits, but the more costly domestic producer loses the sale.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked a lot about that. We
That's how
had
it
that
goes.
down.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Chicken tax.
I really, and I think this is a problem in general. You know, we have companies who maybe we don't need, like, not even because of trade, but maybe we don't need them to be doing their thing anymore, and that can be very disruptive and problematic for
Like automation.
with automation or any kind of
Or if fads, their fad went out of style.
yeah.
Hey,
And then
slap,
you shut down.
slap bracelets. People still, like, you know, we got to subsidize the maker of slap bracelets. Is that still a thing? I
Yeah,
have no idea.
I know about those. But I mean, I don't know that they're so popular anymore.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine so.
You can
But-
buy them on Amazon.
Okay. I just like, you know, do we still need to subsidize the manufacturer of slap bracelets?
Yeah.
Did
And
we ever subsidize the
I
manufacturer?
have no idea. We could have. This is America.
America
God knows.
needs more slap bracelets.
You know-
Pour the subsidies in. They won't buy enough in the free market.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's a good example.
And something interesting about this is that businesses fail all the time. Like, that's a normal part of business, and
Right.
sometimes you just don't get the sales, don't get the customers, and
It's
you go out
healthy
of
for the
business.
economy for that to
Yeah.
happen.
So it's
Unfortunately.
interesting that sometimes we're trying to prevent that from happening.
Right.
And I think maybe it's when, you know, there's enough of a coalition, or it's, you know,
Yep.
more of a whole industry that's being affected or something like
Like
that.
the military-industrial complex. The military doesn't need the tanks, but the representatives say we need tanks so we can produce these jobs or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, if we stopped caring about jobs, then any, you know, military spending proposals and whatever the arguments and bullet points for, like, oh, you know, like, but all the jobs, this is important, you know, that kind of thing, that argument kind of goes out the window. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still on tanks, so we can like keep ourselves safe.
They'd still
Well,
want
yeah,
tanks,
but,
they
like,
just have to find another
But
excuse
like
to
yeah.
get jobs.
sometimes literally the argument comes down to like with one of the fighter jets. It's like, well, if we buy 100 of them, they're $3 billion a piece. But if we buy 200 of them, they're $2 billion a piece. So we should clearly buy 200 of them because then each of them is cheaper.
Bargain tank.
But you're spending $100 billion more
Yeah.
on fighter jets than you actually. Like, you don't need the extra 100 fighter jets. Like, you only need 100. So you're still spending the extra $100 billion, and the real reason is
Right.
people want, you know, the jobs and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and it's not just the money; it's also the resources that go into the. I mean,
All those fighter jets.
labor is one thing, but, you know, all the materials and
Right.
everything. Yeah.
apparently, the incremental, like the baseline cost of one is about $2 billion. I mean, like, I don't know, but
Yeah.
whatever it costs to make one, I mean, it's apparent, you know.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Even if you take the R&D costs and like amortize it over the number you're making,
Right.
Yeah.
then apparently it still costs $1 billion to make one if it costs $200 billion to research it.
Huh.
You know?
That's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. It's funny. When Jared was here, he was talking about the government potentially managing resources efficiently by using, the same kinds of calculations that Amazon uses in their marketplace and stuff like that. But I think there's an important feature of the markets that you lose when you try to make decisions based on anything other than kind of what's profitable or what's competitive. And that isn't to say that we shouldn't have some resources that are centrally managed, but for a lot of things, in order for it to be efficient, people have to be kind of like paying attention to every little cost and that kind of thing, and
Right.
you don't have the incentive to do that
Yeah.
in the military and research and stuff like that. Yeah. You could design a system in which that worked, but I think in order to design a centrally planned system like that, you'd basically have to replicate the market, and then it's still market economy.
But we
You're
were
just calling it
saying
something
before,
else.
You can have a giant supercomputer that calculates all the things, or you can have individual companies with supercomputers, which is more efficient.
Right. So that's basically what I was just saying. So yeah, the idea is that there's this Darwinian process where companies make decisions, and there's no way to know, like, as an outside observer, whether it's the best decision, but they're trying to make the best decision possible to survive. And how do you incentivize that?
Within what was this, like, within research?
Within research, or I would say research is a good example. How do you make it more like a market? How do you make the production of fighter jets look more like a market? Bring some of those incentives back.
Is part of the problem that you just don't have very many customers? Like, what's making it not like a market right now?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that you have one customer and it's the government, and you're just talking them into paying you stuff. And
Well, and then the military actually has this, and all government agencies have this issue where they have to spend their budget every year, or else they risk Congress cutting their budget.
Right.
So literally the
fair.
last day of the budget quarters and years, every month sometimes,
Right.
people will sit outside of government offices with contracts that are ready to be signed,
Wow.
and they'll just walk in there and be like, do you need 1,000 boxes of paper? And the person will be like, no, but I have the budget, and they'll buy 1,000 boxes of paper.
Wow, yeah.
And then they get in trouble if they have the 1,000 boxes of paper sitting around, so then they just print random crap because they have to get rid of the paper. Otherwise, there's a paper trail. I mean, like,
right.
I
I guess part of it, like, even if you had one consumer, you would think you would have, like, a bunch of different, you could have different competitors. So part of it might be they're not so incentivized to just have low cost, like you're talking about, because they kind of have this weird budget system.
Well, part of it is that the contractors are competing for the contracts up front. So it's not like each one of them is building a fighter jet and they're like, hey, buy our fighter jet. It's
so
better.
the same
and
reason
cheaper
why
and,
contracting on your house can be such a nightmare. As
Yeah,
I remember
pretty
from
much.
living in a house with, like, no roof all winter.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember.
One experience that I unduly probably apply to everything. But
Yeah. I remember this anecdote by Andrew Yang that relates
Right.
to what you were saying, David, where he said he knew a guy whose job it was to fly out over the ocean in a fighter jet and dump fuel into the ocean.
No, why?
Because they wanted to keep the budget for the fuel.
This is so bad.
If they didn't dump the fuel and they had extra fuel left, then they'd be like, oh, well, you're not using all that fuel, so we're not going to pay for it.
Is this set up like this?
Yeah.
Why can't you just carry over excess to the next time?
because that's not how we're set up.
I know, but why? Is it because it's just so hard to figure out how much money should be allocated?
Yeah, I mean, there's...
It's so we don't allocate money to a thing. We don't say, hey, Congress, we're going to give you $1 billion, or Congress says we're going to give you $1 billion for fighter jet fuel, and when, you get down to $500 million worth of fighter jet fuel, you come back to us and we'll give you more.
Right.
It's, you have $1 billion you have to spend by July 31st.
Right, but that seems like a bad
And if you don't
system.
spend it, you use it or lose it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
And then
It's
if
same
you
at every
and then if
level
you
of
lose
grants.
it, then the next year when your budget comes in, they'll be like, "Oh, you only used it this
No,
much."
I know. It works
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
way on small level in academia
Yeah.
grants, but it just seems like a bad system.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So how do we fix that?
I don't know, because I was trying to think of, like, what's a better way to decide how much money people need.
Because you don't. I guess the concern with saying how much do you, or say like we'll give you this much and then come back when you need more. The concern is that they'll overuse it.
Yeah.
or something,
Right.
but then they end up overusing it more the other way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, with government shutdowns recently, one thing was some departments were, the way they were budgeted, they had money until a certain day. They have, you have this amount of money to spend by this day. And when the budget didn't get extended, then they actually could not spend another dollar, even if they technically had it in their budget. Other departments had an amount of money to spend, and they were just going to run out of money on about a certain day.
Right.
And they could find ways to stretch it and make it go, and et cetera,
Right.
et cetera. So if a department had to operate in such a way where it's like well, every once in a while you need to make things work, and you do have less resources than you need, so you have to be efficient with them,
Right.
then they ended up finding ways to be efficient when they had to be.
Right.
Yeah. It's tough. This happens within companies too. It's like at every level you have this problem
Yeah.
Yeah.
with budgets. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like trying to solve like other problems of being like, okay, you want the efficiency of not having,
Right.
you don't want to be like, oh, you have like a, like come back whenever you need a thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
'Cause
really
that's super
inefficient.
inefficient.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to say like, oh yeah, you could just roll over this money. So people are just like, cool, we're sitting on this largesse. Because
Right.
we asked you for $1 million, and we only need $100,000.
Yeah, right.
Over every year, like you want to
Yeah.
have, but then you end up with these other problems.
I know it's hard to think of a better solution. It's tough.
I used to do budgeting at a company, a large
Oh
company.
yeah.
And one of the problems we would run into is you would look at something and you would say, okay, you're doing this, so you need this much money or this many things to do this thing, and to buy this many of the thing will cost this much, so there's your budget.
Right.
But companies would use it, or departments would use it inefficiently, and at the end of the, they get to month 11 of the year and say, hey, we accidentally used up our whole budget, give us more money.
Right.
And it's just sort of like, what do you do at that point? Because the department has to continue to operate,
Right.
but they
Yeah.
they kind of use things inefficiently throughout the year, and then
I feel like if you did that enough rounds, it would improve because people kind of learn.
they
Well,
fire
Unless you
people.
give them the money. If you give them
Well,
the
you
money,
give
then
them
it's
like a
more
little bit
You
of
give
money,
them the
but
money,
they
then you
also
fire
are
the
like a
managers,
bit not.
and then
as
you
good-
fire them.
You fire the manager of the
I see.
department.
Yeah,
the
because
person who misspent
like there
the
has
money.
to be
Right.
some punishment for the people who are misusing
Right,
the
right.
resources.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's like, oh, well, I had to go like beg my department head, but like that's just what I do every May.
Mm,
Like
yeah.
it's
Right.
fine, and because it's like, okay, like I'm salaried, and so like I'm still getting my paycheck. It's just like
Yeah.
because there's something that is amortized, but like if you have, like at least where I work, like if you have a research assistant, like it's like okay, so like X amount of your budget is for this person, and it gets paid out every 2 weeks, and so like if you burned through because someone's keeping an eye on it, so they would be like, I see that you have spent like $90,000 of your budget, and like that will leave you with $10,000, but you're supposed to pay like $15,000 to this person for the remainder of the year. Like,
Right.
we're gonna flag. So like they flag it then, and not like when it gets to zero.
Well, yeah, you flag it before it gets to zero, but like sometimes behavior doesn't change. It gets kind of convoluted. It's just people are not efficient with resources when they're allocated a resource. When they're allocated just a flat amount to do a thing, it doesn't
Right.
happen. People, if it's not your money, you're not going to be the most efficient with
Yeah,
it.
I think that's right. But I guess I would guess that over enough time, like if it was sufficiently inconvenient and potentially reputationally bad, at least, or someone got fired, like over enough iterations of this, people would learn how to spread the money out.
You'd
in
be
a different kind of
surprised. Like I think both ways you'd be surprised. Sometimes they'll learn immediately,
Right.
and sometimes nobody will ever like actually take the advice that you're giving them of like, well, you clearly don't need to do this inefficient thing.
And why do you
Right.
think it is?
But
Well-
is that even like in a punishment mechanism?
Oh yeah, no,
Like-
I've seen it.
Do you think those are the cases where you guys got it wrong?
Right. So that's what I was going to say. Sometimes it can be hard to tell what's efficient
Right.
and what's not.
Well, so
just
you-
objectively.
Yeah.
Exactly. A
So-
lot of the time, I would think.
Yeah.
It would be.
So one of the things like we looked at was labor budgets specifically,
Mm-hmm.
and you had to match your labor up to your KVIs to a certain degree. Like if
What's
you
the
have
KVI?
key volume indicator.
What's that?
Like, let's say you run a restaurant. You're going to serve more people in your restaurant on Fridays and Saturdays and
Mhm.
Sundays than you are on Tuesdays. Like, that's just a fact. So, you would expect the number of people you serve in a restaurant on a Tuesday to be like
well,
6 an hour, 7 an
calibrated,
hour.
as it were.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
Those people.
Yeah, so you'd have 2 people working a dinner shift on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
And then you'd have 30 people come in an hour on a Friday night, and you'd need 10 servers. So, that's the key volume indicators. But for some reason, sometimes the restaurants would schedule 5 people to be there on Tuesday and 8 people to be there on Friday. And then you look at that and you go, well, people aren't getting the service level that we as the parent company are expecting on the Friday, so they're not happy.
Right.
They're not, you're not being efficient there.
Right.
And then you have people sitting around doing nothing on a Tuesday.
So why don't you move some more people?
Yeah. And then sometimes it would be disproportionate in such a way that they would use up their labor budget, like just having extra people on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays throughout the course of the year that they never should have scheduled.
Yeah, that makes sense. So why not learn? That seems easy enough to learn.
Yeah.
So maybe they were getting like a lot of pushback from the servers or something who didn't want to work on the weekends.
Yeah.
I mean, that might have been it. Like, people wanted their hours, but they didn't want to work on the weekend.
Right.
It could be that they overscheduled during the week because they had more calls during the week. It could be, there could be 1,000 reasons. But, like, at the end of the day, like, the manager of the restaurant needed to be the one to figure out how to make that work efficiently.
Right.
And if they couldn't, then that was an issue.
Makes sense to me. Seems
Makes
straightforward. Yeah.
All right, let's get back to some international trade stuff. I mean, this is a really interesting question. Like, how?
Yeah, it is actually. I find
how
it
can
really
you allocate
tough.
resources
Yeah.
efficiently when you don't have
a
the
market.
right incentives?
Yeah,
and that kind
exactly
of thing?
right.
Yeah.
It's really tough. Yeah,
So,
very tough.
except in cases in which the costs of production do not include such social costs as pollution, the world is better off when countries import products that are produced more efficiently in other countries. So this brings up the question of pollution and other externalities.
Yeah, likely we ship our computer parts over to Africa, and then they pick through all the parts for different things. Like in the movie I watched last week, the boy who harnessed the wind, they were just like dumped all these like air conditioner parts and things like that, and just dump, and then they pick through them, and then
So how does that relate to this?
that's like pollution.
Oh,
it's
because
exporting our pollution, basically.
I see.
Right.
Exporting our pollution.
It would be actually more efficient to sift through those things here, probably in a factory setting that was clean and organized and etc. But we literally, like, we send out ships full of like contaminated fluids to Bangladesh, and then they get beached there. Like, that's actually a thing that happens, and then the water there is polluted, the soil there is polluted, and there's this scrap heap sitting on the beach.
Right.
And is that through some agreement we have with Bangladesh? Or?
I mean, it's not necessarily that, like, the U.S. does it. It's that companies will basically scrub a ship of their identity and then do this.
Oh, so it's an illegal thing.
It happens illegally.
I see.
But, like,
Gotcha.
the countries that these ships are coming from aren't really doing anything to prevent it. So,
Right.
like, Bangladesh doesn't have a great enforcement mechanism for these things, but, the U.S., Australia, etc. could do more about it.
Right. So there's kind of like an imbalance of other kinds of power, like the U.S. wouldn't allow other countries to like dump pollution on its beaches because it has like the infrastructure to stop that.
Yeah.
And Bangladesh doesn't, so you get like these crimes are not equally distributed, I guess.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the pollution is not being equally distributed. I mean,
I guess that's what I meant by the crime.
it's not exactly production, but it's kind of the inverse of production. It is disposal. Yeah. In other countries, there's a tax on disposal of goods. For example, if you produce something, you have to pay a tax to the government when it is imported or when it's at sale points to cover the cost of disposing of that good eventually.
Like with the recycling of cans, 5 cents or whatever.
Well, I mean, actually, they're cost less than that to deal with, but like it's more of an incentive for people to do it in the cost of cans. I'm talking like that microphone. That microphone, for somebody to take it apart and put it back into its component goods and like take the metal parts and take the plastic parts and et cetera, might cost $1. Let's just say it costs $1. In other countries, there is a dollar cost added to that microphone when it's either finished manufacturing or enters the country. And they basically say, you need to pay for this now. You pass off the cost to the consumer, whatever that is, but you need to pay for this now so that we can take this apart when people are done with it and deal with it in a good way.
Because that's like a government-run service.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah. Like in France, it's 90% of the disposal cost is a tax. In the UK, it's 10%. In the United States, it's nothing, effectively.
Right.
So, different countries have different ratios of it, et cetera, and some places apply to certain goods and not others. But what ends up happening is it keeps that pollution from being moved around in such a way, and it keeps the people who actually are responsible for that potential pollution, so that maybe that microphone wouldn't end up in a landfill when Alex is done with it, because Alex is definitely going to go throw it in little Charles and pollute the Charles.
Alex,
I didn't tell you that.
Like, he's going to be walking along the Charles one day. He's going to be talking to his microphone. It won't work. We'll just throw it in. But like it means that cost of actually using the good is passed along the entire way.
Right.
So
I guess that would like disincentivize people from buying goods with higher per disposal costs, all else being equal.
Right, because they'd be more expensive.
Which could be smart.
It actually reduces packaging the most. Is the most
that
interesting
makes
part of it.
Like
You get a lot more easy opening cardboard packaging than the hard plastic shells and et cetera, et cetera.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's
kind of a good way to include the externality into the price and incentivize people.
So it's a production cost at the end. It's putting that pollution into a production cost, which I think kind of resolves that issue entirely when you put the pollution cost into the production cost.
Right. So bringing it back to trade, we might say that people should refuse to trade with us unless we institute some kind of disposal cost in the price.
Yeah, because that's actually a good example for this. Because I was wondering how the externalities issue relates to trade. Because on the one hand, if it's more efficient, that can be more efficient, even including pollution. So trade could be good for pollution in that way. But I guess what this could also mean is there might be an externality in the fact that you're buying all this stuff from the U.S., which is that your country is going to have to deal with the disposal, and that's not really captured in the price of the good from the U.S.
Yeah.
So it seems cheap, but it's not actually cheap when you think about it.
Right. It might be more efficient in terms of just price, but less efficient in terms of overall, impact. Exactly. I guess that's what makes it an externality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We're saying the same.
But I mean, I think another example of this is child labor, that kind of thing.
Maybe you just care about that and don't want that to happen.
I don't want to trade with a country that's employing children
or blood diamonds
or blood diamonds.
Maybe you only want I'm just saying
Yeah, I mean, child labor is an interesting thing because then you have to ask, is it a problem, or is the problem that people are sending their children off to work, or is the problem that their society is in such a state that families are better off sending their children to go off to work? So that's a tricky thing too. If you refuse to trade with them because they have child workers, then that might end up making everyone worse off, including the children. So that can be a tricky thing as well.
I mean, for the most part, countries that allow child labor need people to have jobs the most, which means that, cutting off, like you were just saying.
Right, yeah.
But if you say, I want to trade with a country that has child labor because I want to improve their means without just donate money or whatever else, then you're actually benefiting everybody in that country.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that would generally be true, but I think a lot of times in our trade agreements we say we'll only trade with you if you stop having child labor, and then that can kind of cancel out some of the benefits sometimes.
Another example, for example, country A has very cheap goods, but the emissions are really bad for global warming. It's just carbon city everywhere. You could get a lot of cheap goods for a while from that country, but it might actually come around to be more of a problem than a benefit than if you produced them yourself or got them from a country that was slightly more expensive. That's another externality that's not in the price.
Yeah. So another question is, so how do we avoid some of these externalities?
It's tough.
Because a lot of times when we think about international trade, we think that the country that's exporting stuff is the one who's benefiting, right?
We do?
Not us, but economists and
us.
policymakers. They tend to think, okay, the country that's exporting more, that's higher GDP, that's better for them. And certainly it's true for the individual companies in terms of their profit. That's better for them to export. But if you start to look at things from our perspective of the country that's getting more stuff is the one that's winning, then are you really punishing a country by telling them you don't want to buy their stuff? They could, they can still buy your stuff potentially, or maybe they can't. I don't know. Or they could, sell their stuff to their consumers. They can say, "Hey, here's more basic income consumers. You can buy this stuff."
But my example isn't so much about like punishing the country. It's
Your
just
example?
My example of pollution causing global warming.
Okay.
It's not about punishing the country by not buying their stuff. It's literally about not having the pollution happen
Right.
by not buying their stuff. Because you buy from a country with less polluting factories instead, or you produce it yourself and it has less pollution.
Right, but they might still produce the same stuff for their own citizens.
Yeah, but they have fewer people buying it, right? If your whole country's not buying it. So the factories are not
There
running
would be
as
less
much.
pollution overall,
Right.
because they're running at 80% capacity to only produce domestically, where they were previously running at 100% and exporting that 20%.
Right, exactly. That's how I was thinking about it.
Right, so they might not actually suffer from the trade restriction, but they'd also, like, you'd be the one suffering, but you're taking that hit because you want the lowest
That's what I was
pollution.
thinking about it. I was like trading off your own suffering by not getting the cheap stuff
Like,
versus
we don't
like,
get the cheap stuff from China, but in doing so we're preventing pollution, and
exactly.
China's no worse off, but we have less pollution,
Right.
and we're taking a little bit of the cost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or
Okay,
with
that
your
makes
example,
sense.
it's even more straightforward, like with the disposal cost. It's like, if we take the disposal cost into account, maybe it's not worth buying from the U.S. anymore, because it seems cheaper, but it's actually going to be a pain to dispose of, and so it's not cheaper.
Yeah, or if there's a carbon tax, and the fact that
Right.
the good in China costs more, like pollution-wise, would be considered in the cost, because they would pay the carbon. If there was an international carbon tax, in theory, then they would pay the carbon tax on producing the good.
Mhm.
You would look at that and you would say, okay, well, with the carbon tax incorporated, your good is now more expensive than this good from Norway.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and the same thing for the disposal costs. You could say, like, okay, we're importing goods from the United States. They don't impose their own disposal costs on the price of the goods, so we'll just add it.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Even that's tricky politically, because like the cost is borne by the government, the benefit is borne by the consumer.
Yeah.
Like if you have like a cheaper good. If you have like a cheaper good where it doesn't have the disposal cost is kind of like borne by the government, and meanwhile you get to have like this cheaper good.
Wait, what?
I'm talking about the politics of like adding that disposal cost to the product or not.
Yeah.
And I'm saying the entities are not exactly one-to-one. Like if you think about the politics within the country, I want to buy, like as an individual consumer, I might want to buy this thing as cheaply as possible and have the government kind of handle the disposal cost for me in a more diffuse way that probably doesn't like really
I thought
show
you were
up.
saying something different. Yeah, if the government adds the disposal cost to it, then that hurts the consumer.
Right.
And benefits the government.
Like it might benefit the country as a whole, but given that not everyone buys that product, the consumers who buy it might prefer.
5 years ago or whatever, they removed the gas tax to make gas cheaper because it was harming consumers or something. It made the roads poorer, so it affected their tires. So they had to go through more tires or something.
Interesting.
Or there's
Why did it make the roads poorer?
Because the gas taxes directly fund roads.
Oh, I see.
Like an amount of the road funding
and
comes
people would
directly
drive
from
more. Is
because
causing the
Right.
roads to have more wear.
Okay.
Interesting.
And
So I see that's just like a quirk of the way it's set up. In
Well,
terms
not
of what
the
gas
wear
tax-
on the roads isn't though.
Right.
Yeah.
But in terms of what the gas tax goes to pay for, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like we could easily pay for roads without having it be tied to the gas tax if we
We
wanted
also
to.
pay for public transportation without having to be.
Yeah, there you go. So I want to get back to what you were saying before, because I thought I was following it and then I wasn't.
I don't think it's that important. I think it's just another one of the examples where like different people are going to advocate for slightly different things.
I understand that. I understand that part of
I
it.
heard what you were saying, and
That
I
was
think
my
I can
point.
simplify it a
Yeah.
little bit. So, let's say you have trash.
Yeah.
Let's just say you're only talking about trash, actual
Yeah.
trash that goes in the trash can.
Yeah.
You produce one little tiny bag of trash every week.
Okay.
You produce one giant jumbo 55-gallon
This is true to life
drum
stuff.
of trash every week.
No.
You are effectively paying the same amount for trash to be removed than you,
Right,
as you
exactly.
are.
So it's
So
just different.
she is consuming more, she is buying more. The government is taxing you equally effectively to deal with the fact that she is producing more trash. But does this make sense?
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that the government just tax everyone equally to pay for the disposal costs. I was
Yeah,
suggesting
but
that the
she's-
government.
No, but I'm
Well,
saying if the
in
government
Taiwan-
adds a fee to the purchasing of the mics,
Yeah.
than to pay for the disposal cost.
Yeah.
Then that's a shift away from this kind of like diffuse use of taxes to pay for disposal, in which case me as the mic buyer is hit less than if I'm now actually paying the full price
You're hit
per
more.
mic.
You're hit more. You're hit
Sorry,
less.
I'm hit less when like there's no disposal tax on this thing than when
Right.
there is a disposal tax on this thing.
Right. You're hit more by the disposal tax.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
so the people who buy mics would be like in general against adding that, even if it's good for the whole country. It's just not another one of these examples.
Oh, okay.
Like politically, like you could have a mic buyer coalition, and you wouldn't because you don't care that much about mics. But like politically, people who buy more of the products are going to be like paying more of the cost of that change.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I didn't. That's all you were saying?
Yeah, it wasn't a big
Oh,
point. I think I
alright.
just didn't make it very clearly.
Yeah. I didn't understand it very clearly. Yeah. Go
In
ahead.
Taiwan, they actually charge people per bag, and the trash companies sell bags to the people so that they.
Okay.
And then David was saying in Ireland they don't have like
public
public
trash disposal.
people. Yeah,
private companies.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's true in our hometown, I think.
In some
Yeah.
in some places, you
Yeah.
actually have to get it picked up by you have to
Right.
call somebody to come
Or
pick it
pay
up.
to put it at the dump or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Taiwan, though, specifically, recycling is always free,
Ah,
but you have to sort it yourself.
interesting.
So people have these complex bins where they have clear glass and clear plastic and brown plastic and blue glass, and then they have. But then they buy the trash bags, and the trash bags are generally the small little trash bags.
Huh.
And they cost $1 a piece or something like that.
Right.
But everything, if you can break it up into component parts yourself, and you're not actually throwing anything away, that part of it is free. They also have trash trucks come by 3 times a day, so that
Oh.
makes it a little easier, or several times a week at any rate.
And they have
3 times a day
they
sounds like
play
a
the song like Beethoven or something.
They,
like that.
they play the ice cream truck song.
Nice, nice.
Okay.
The
That's
same
funny.
song that the ice cream truck song. That's what they play.
So, do they have ice cream trucks there too? Because that can be
I
confusing.
hope so. I hope so.
Wait, is it the trash?
The kids are running oh.
Yeah. No, it's the same song, I believe. I think it is in a different melody or different. I'm not musically
Yeah.
inclined, but
Alright.
a different pitch. But yeah, it's the same song.
So they're not going to stop on their own unless you come out with some trash, basically.
They actually tend to park every half a block or so, and then they wait
I see.
there. People come when people have left, then they move on to the next half a block or so.
Sounds a lot like an ice cream truck.
Does,
Yeah.
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 All right.
Anyway, it's also a very densely populated island, which
Yeah.
makes that a little bit more efficient
makes
there than it
sense.
would be
Right.
here.
All right, let's do another one. Trade also brings dislocation to those firms that cannot cut it. Firms that face difficult adjustment because of more efficient foreign producers often lobby against trade, so do their workers. They often seek barriers such as import taxes called tariffs and quotas to raise the price or limit the availability of imports. So I guess this kind of relates to what we were talking about special interests. And, yeah.
Like with Trump's trade war, I posted that video from Vice and on the meetup page, and how just like an hour apart, a company was producing nails, and they opened this factory 5 years before, and after a few months after the trade war began, they had to close the second factory, and so they laid off all these people. Well, this other company was producing all this aluminum, and
These are both Chinese companies?
No, it was in Missouri,
Oh, okay.
and they laid off. They had to lay off all these people because they couldn't compete with China. And after the trade war, they had all these people, and they're like, "We love Trump because he gave us all these jobs back," or something like that.
Interesting.
So, not to make it political, the actual thing is a lot of domestic suppliers of finished steel and aluminum goods imported raw steel or aluminum from China,
Right.
used that to manufacture the goods here. After the tariffs came into effect, the tariffs were only on raw steel, effectively. I mean, steel bars, I-beams, etc., not the finished products. So it made it such that it was actually cheaper to produce the finished good in the foreign country and import the finished good rather than the component to make the finished good
Right.
here. Like that's the actual fact.
So that's
I
why
think
the
you're
nail
talking
people
about.
would go under.
Yeah.
So
So
because
the
the nails
steel
were the
cost-
finished product.
The
Yeah.
steel,
Okay,
yeah.
I see.
So
Yeah.
the steel costs 25% more. All of a sudden, it's 25% more expensive for your only raw material, effectively,
Yeah.
besides the labor to make a nail.
So the nail people lost their jobs as a result of the
Yeah.
trade restrictions.
I mean, a lot of people like the Slinkies actually were like, I believe, an example of something that like
Okay.
they stopped making in the U.S. all of a sudden.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, because anytime you're trading, I mean, if it's resources and materials, you're using that stuff, and
Yeah.
it's not as and yeah, I mean, you look at the special interests, and sometimes the costs are diffuse, and sometimes you can really point to
Yeah.
like specific examples of people that are being hurt by it.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And I was going to point out too, it's interesting,
Yeah.
like this relates to your point about who we usually frame as benefiting from export. But one of the major counter arguments against tariffs is often this idea of retaliation. So not
Right.
the cost of just not being able to import things cheaply, but the retaliatory
this.
tariffs that the other
Yeah.
country might put on.
Right.
So that's like a little bit backwards from the way that you would usually.
Yeah,
think
it's
about
like
it,
if
I
you
think.
shoot yourself in your foot, I'm going to shoot myself in my foot, and you'll be sorry.
But that's one of the most persuasive political arguments that people bring up, I think.
Right, but yeah,
Retaliatory tariffs.
Everyone, an eye for an eye, and the whole world goes
Right.
blind. And,
right.
Yeah.
It's just the difference is you're poking out your own eye in this case.
Like with the farm subsidies, $7.7 billion because China's not importing our soybeans or whatever.
Yeah, soybeans were rotting in the fields because China stopped buying our soybeans. Because at the end of the day, like Brazilian soybeans were so marginally more expensive that it didn't really matter anymore.
I see. That was a retaliatory measure.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Or I mean, was it just that? Right. So you're saying the tariffs made the American soybeans more expensive, and then when they lifted them, they just stayed with the Brazilian ones anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they've actually lifted them yet.
Okay.
But
But they
the
probably
contracts
will.
for the next few years have already been signed for Brazilian soybeans. So
I see.
like nobody's going to buy them for the next couple of years anyway. And some of that change will probably be permanent. Like the soybean farmers in the U.S. will never sell as many soybeans to China, or not for many, many years. Like suppose if China got into a trade war with Brazil in 10 years, then that's a whole other matter.
Right.
Well, I imagine that it might even stay more profitable to buy the Brazilian soybeans because now they're producing soybeans and they're keeping that
Economy of
capacity up,
scale,
and
exactly.
we don't anymore. Yeah, so that's interesting.
The worst part of it is American farmers are still going to produce almost as many soybeans this year.
Why?
Because they think that they'll be able to sell them this year, even though they couldn't last year. And they don't really have anything else to do. Like, they're like, well, I'm a soybean farmer.
Right.
I mean, in theory, they could clearly grow something else, but yeah. It's only going down a marginal percentage this year, as expected to only.
All right. Oh, I like this one because it brings us back to our countries.
Oh yeah,
up here.
this is an interesting one. I remember this.
Moreover, trade barriers affect some countries more than others. Often the hardest hit are the less developed countries whose exports are concentrated in low-skill, labor-intensive products that industrialized countries can often protect. So let's look at Hatland. Before they all started trading, Hatland, was very poor, or relative to Shoeland was very poor. Then when they started trading, the amount of benefit they got was greater than the amount of benefit that everyone else got.
Yep.
So if you cut off that trading, then the amount of benefit they lose, or the cost they pay, is going to be higher than the cost everyone else pays. But on top of that, when they were trading, Hatland lost its capacity for chairs and shoes.
Right.
They're all about hats now. All they have is hats. They have no other way to get chairs and shoes other than by trading them.
Right.
So if you cut off trade after that transition has happened, now the cost Hatland pays is more than just the cost of going back to the way things work, because they can't just automatically go back to the way things work.
Right.
So I think this is a perfect illustration of what it's talking about here.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think your point is the main point. A side point that this seems to also be implying is that we often add the tariffs to the kind of low skill, low labor things. This is kind of what you were mentioning about the raw steel and not the nails. And that might have to do with some of the politics of who lobbies the hardest or something like, something along those lines.
The nail lobby is smaller than the steel lobby.
Right. And maybe also with the bargaining power points I was making. So that kind of does come back to basic income. Like the less bargaining power you have, or the less, by that I mean like the less your labor is just like generally in demand and maybe like flexible across industries, the more you're going to advocate for these kinds of tariffs. So that may have something to do with why it's those particular kinds of products that tend to have the tariffs more than like the high skill products, right? So that would suggest that like maybe with the basic income that change.
Yeah, I really do think. I really do think basic income is compatible with free trade and more people feeling the benefit of it.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe less of a desire to impose these kinds of restrictions. Yeah.
Last quote. We can make it.
We can make it
through them all.
Despite successes, restrictive and discriminatory trade policies remain common. Addressing them could yield hundreds of billions of dollars in annual global benefits, but narrow interests have sought to delay and dilute further multilateral reforms. A focus on the greater good, together with ways to help the relatively few that may be adversely affected, can help deliver a fairer and economically more sensible trading system. All right, so let's go around and get people's final thoughts on international trade and basic income.
I really liked this a lot. I was really into it. I feel like I learned a lot of key things that I didn't totally have down before.
Okay.
Which is really cool. I really hope that a basic income helps with more free trade that happens.
Okay. Yeah. David.
So I think that basic income, I am pro basic income. That's, part. I like to play devil's advocate, but I'm pro it. I do think that it is very complicated by international trade and free trade. And I think that you would see some really negative impacts of some areas instituting it without other areas instituting it.
Would have been cool to talk more about that, actually. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's like the one thing we didn't really get to talk about as much, but we did touch on it, but it raises a lot of concerns and kind of puts my hackles up a little bit, so to speak, and I just not to go into one world currency, but if many countries instituted it more or less simultaneously, more or less equally, I think it'd be a lot better for everyone than if one group did it unilaterally.
Yeah.
So I think that's just like the one thing to keep in mind about how it could be impacted by international trade without protectionism. That it gets dispersed immediately, and like short to medium term, I don't know how that would work out.
Okay. Elizabeth.
Some things about how international trade works. I feel like in that absence of basic income, a lot of the stuff that is sort of like, oh yeah, like trade is like really good in these ways feels sort of like tenuous to me. Like it's like good in scare quotes because a lot of that doesn't actually trickle down to like regular people. It just gets captured by firms, like the rich people who own them, and so a lot. I was like, oh yeah, like in like a world with like universal basic income, like this seems fine, but like in the world in which we're in now, like it still feels kind of sketchy, which I recognize sort of outside the scope of this. This is like so basic income and this thing, but
cool. Richard.
Well, learned a lot about with that chart with the comparative advantages, and if you don't have tariffs and things like that, if you actually have free trade, then it seems that pretty much everyone would benefit, except for the people who didn't have who benefited from from the tariffs from before. Is that that basic income would mean that they wouldn't need to lobby for all those tariffs and things like that, and would enable the economy not to have a need for these tariffs and things, and it would like you said before, the shoe had the basic income. They would be able to have a stronger currency, and they would benefit more from the trade than countries that didn't have a basic income or a lesser one, and they would have they could just shell out a bunch of currency, and the hat economy would want to hold on to it, so they would be able to disperse even more currency to them, and they would keep benefiting from it.
Yeah, great comments, you guys. I think my overall sense is that free trade is generally going to benefit all the countries, but each country individually is not going to be able to maximize its own benefit from either its own productive capacity or the capacity to trade with others without something like a basic income in place. And furthermore, there's the question of each country is instituting its own economic policies. Who do we care about? Do we care about only our own citizens? Do we care about everyone in the world? To what extent should there be, would it make sense to have a global basic income? Because if you're a hat country and you can only afford to pay, or hat land, and you can only, your country has a much smaller productive capacity, you can't just add a basic income at the level of the United States without some kind of promise that you're going to be able to access productive capacity from the United States, or if you have the same currency. So it raises the questions of, should we have a global currency? Should we have a global basic income, denominated in that currency? And, what about free movement of people? That kind of thing. Can that help the economy be more efficient? So it really opens up the whole globalization thing and the potential benefits of globalization if you have a basic income and you care about everyone in the world. So yeah, that's that. Thanks, guys. Next week, we're talking about the Finland experiment and some of the results that have been coming in for that. Yeah.
Cool. A lot of people ask about that, so maybe they'll
yeah.
They just concluded it last month.